It was an ordinary day when Chandra pulled into her driveway, ready to relax after a long day at work. She had been moving nonstop, attending meetings, making decisions, and keeping her community running smoothly as the mayor. It wasn't an easy job, but she loved it. The small suburban neighborhood she lived in was quiet and peaceful, mostly made up of families and elderly residents. Most of the time, Chandra kept to herself, knowing the demands of her job kept her busy enough. As she drove up the street, she noticed two of her neighbors standing on the sidewalk, chatting. Nothing unusual there, except that they seemed to glance over at her a little more than normal. They quickly exchanged looks before one of them pulled out a phone and started dialing. Chandra thought little of it at first, assuming maybe they were just calling someone about a neighborhood event or something else. She parked her car and grabbed her bag, but something in the air felt different. Walking up to her door, she saw the neighbors continuing to talk, and it seemed like they were watching her more than usual. It was odd, but Chandra didn't pay it too much attention. She had learned over the years not to read too much into things. Maybe they were talking about the weather or the latest neighborhood gossip. However, as she approached the front door, she heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. Chandra paused for a second and looked toward the end of the street. A police car was pulling in. Confusion filled her mind. Was there an emergency she wasn't aware of? Did someone need help nearby? Before she could figure it out, the police car stopped right in front of her house. Two officers stepped out, and Chandra's heart skipped a beat. As she turned to greet them, the officers started walking toward her. One of them spoke up, his voice calm but firm. They had received a call about a suspicious person in the area. Chandra was taken aback. What? Her? A suspicious person? She didn't know what to think. She wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. She had just come home like she always did. The officers didn't seem to know what to make of the situation either. They looked at her, then at each other, clearly unsure of what was going on. "Ma'am, we received a report about someone acting suspicious in the neighborhood," one of the officers explained. "We just need to check things out." Chandra was taken off guard, but she remained calm. She tried to explain that she lived here, that she was just coming home from a long day, but the officers didn't seem convinced. The way they were looking at her, like she didn't belong, made her feel uncomfortable. It was as if the idea of a black woman walking up to her own house in this neighborhood didn't sit well with them. The situation was getting stranger by the second. She noticed her two neighbors were standing across the street, watching the whole interaction unfold. They didn't approach, but their eyes were fixed on her, filled with confusion. Chandra couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the police showing up out of nowhere. It was the fact that someone had called them in the first place. Why? As she stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, it hit her. The officers had no idea who she was. She wasn't just a resident of this neighborhood, she was the mayor. She had worked hard for this position, earned the respect of her community, and had been in office for years. But none of that mattered at the moment. To these officers, she was just a black woman who didn't seem to fit in. At that moment, Chandra knew exactly what she had to do. Instead of continuing to explain herself, she calmly reached for her bag and pulled out her ID. "I'm the mayor of this town," she said, showing them her identification. The officers stopped in their tracks. For a moment, they stared at the ID in disbelief. "Mayor?" one of them asked, his voice a little unsure. Chandra nodded. It was hard to imagine what was going through their heads. They had just assumed she didn't belong here, and now they were stunned. The situation didn't feel real. Chandra had been through many challenges in her life, but never had she felt so small, so out of place in her own home. All she had wanted was to go inside, relax, and forget about the busy day she had just had. Instead, she was standing outside, surrounded by police officers, trying to prove that she had the right to live where she lived. The officers seemed to recover quickly, their demeanor softening as they realized their mistake. They apologized, but Chandra could tell their discomfort ran deeper than just a misunderstanding. Her neighbors, still watching from across the street, were now looking at her with a mix of curiosity and embarrassment. Chandra stood there for a moment, still trying to process everything that had just happened. She had barely walked through the door of her home, expecting to enjoy a peaceful evening. And now she found herself facing police officers who had come to her house based on a call made by her neighbors. The confusion in the officers' eyes seemed to mirror the shock she felt. It was almost as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. One of the officers, a little embarrassed, quickly apologized for the misunderstanding. "We're sorry, ma'am. We just had to check it out," he said, his voice a little softer now. "We were told there was someone acting suspicious." Chandra nodded, still trying to keep her composure. She understood they were just doing their job, but it didn't sit right with her that someone would call the police on her for simply being at her own house. It wasn't lost on her that the only reason she was being treated this way was because of her race. As much as she wanted to dismiss the idea, the truth was staring her in the face. It wasn't the first time she had felt like an outsider, even in her own community, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. "I live here," she said calmly, trying to diffuse the tension. "I've been living here for years." The officer nodded again, and the other one looked a little more uncomfortable. "We just have to follow up on any call we get," the second officer added quickly. "It's routine." But Chandra could tell by the way they were speaking that they didn't fully understand what had happened. Behind them, her neighbors, the ones who had made the call, were still standing across the street. They hadn't moved an inch, just watching, waiting for what would happen next. Chandra didn't need to look at them to know what they were thinking. They probably expected something dramatic, maybe even something bad to happen. They had made the call out of fear, based on their assumptions of who she was and what she represented. She wondered if they even realized how much their actions had affected her. It was painful. Chandra knew that many people in the neighborhood probably thought she didn't belong here. That somehow, a black woman living in this peaceful, mostly white neighborhood was out of place. But she had proven herself time and time again. She had worked tirelessly to help her town grow, to help families like theirs thrive, and to make her community a better place for everyone. And yet, all it took was a phone call to remind her that, in the eyes of some, she was still seen as an outsider. As the officers continued to apologize, Chandra's mind wandered. She'd have been the mayor for several years now, elected by the very people who lived in this neighborhood. She had worked hard to build relationships, help solve problems, and improve the quality of life for everyone. But this incident made it clear that some people still saw her as different. They didn't see the leader, the public servant. They saw only the color of her skin. The officers lingered for a few moments longer, clearly unsure of what to say next. They seemed to want to leave, but they didn't want to make the situation worse. Finally, one of them spoke again. "Again, we apologize for the confusion," he said. "If you need anything, just let us know." Chandra nodded, appreciating their attempt to make things right, but the damage had already been done. The officers turned and walked back to their patrol car, leaving Chandra standing there, more alone than she had felt in a long time. As the car pulled away, she couldn't help but glance across the street at her neighbors. They hadn't moved, still standing there, staring at her. It was in that moment that Chandra realized she wasn't just a mayor dealing with a misunderstanding. She was a black woman in a world where people often judged her before they even got to know her. Her neighbors had called the police, assuming the worst, not because of anything she had done, but because of the way she looked. She didn't know what was more hurtful, the fact that they had made that call in the first place, or the way they were now avoiding her, unsure of how to act now that the truth had been revealed. She wasn't just their neighbor anymore. She was the mayor, and suddenly that seemed to change everything. As she stood on her front porch, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and frustration. But most of all, she felt tired. Tired of fighting against assumptions, tired of having to prove herself over and over again. But she wasn't going to let this moment define her. She was the mayor, and she wasn't going anywhere. For now, though, she needed a moment to herself. A moment to process everything that had just happened, and to remind herself that, no matter how hard people tried to define her, she knew who she was. As Chandra stepped inside her house, she took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension from the incident. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, she just stood there, letting the silence settle around her. It was a strange kind of silence, though, one that was filled with thoughts of the events that had just unfolded. She had always known that living in a predominantly white neighborhood would come with its challenges, but today had been different. It wasn't just a case of dealing with the usual stares or whispered comments. This time, it was more serious. Someone had actually called the police on her. And for what? Simply because she didn't fit the picture of who they thought should live in the neighborhood. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at the table. Her mind was racing, but she tried to focus on the facts. She was the mayor, and she had earned that title through years of hard work, dedication, and a genuine desire to serve her community. But that didn't matter to some people. They saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. It hurt more than she cared to admit. As she sat there, staring at the glass in her hand, Chandra thought about the officers' faces. They had been confused, surprised even, when she showed them her ID. It was clear they hadn't expected the woman standing in front of them to be the mayor of their town. They had probably never even thought twice about her before. In their eyes, she was just another black woman in a neighborhood where people like her didn't belong. She could tell by the way they looked at her that they were uncomfortable. They didn't know how to handle the situation. She couldn't help but wonder how much of their discomfort was rooted in the way they saw her, or the way they've been taught to see people like her. It wasn't just about the police officers. It was about the neighbors who had made the call. They hadn't known her, hadn't taken the time to understand who she was or what she represented. To them, she was just a stranger in their neighborhood, someone who didn't fit their idea of who should live there. The fact that they hadn't even considered the possibility that she was someone important, someone who had the right to be there, spoke volumes. Chandra could still see their faces in her mind. The neighbors had looked nervous when they saw the police car pulling away, like they weren't sure how to act. They hadn't come over to apologize or explain themselves. They just stood there, across the street, watching from a distance. Chandra knew that deep down, they probably felt embarrassed. But their embarrassment didn't change the fact that they had made that call, assuming she didn't belong in their neighborhood. She wasn't sure which hurt more, their assumptions or the fact that they hadn't even bothered to try and get to know her. The whole situation made Chandra feel like an outsider in a place that was supposed to be her home. She had built a life here. She had been elected to serve this community, to represent every person in it, regardless of their background. But none of that seemed to matter when someone decided to make a judgment call based on how she looked. For a moment, Chandra thought about all the work she had done in the town. She had pushed for improvements in education, worked to create new jobs, and helped make the town safer for families. She had brought people together, regardless of race or background, to build a stronger community. But now, in the wake of this incident, she couldn't help but feel like none of that mattered. She wasn't just the mayor. She was a black woman, and to some people, that was all they saw. As the minutes passed, Chandra tried to focus on the positives. Yes, the situation had been uncomfortable, but it had also opened her eyes to something important. People still saw her as different, and that needed to change. Maybe it wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was up to her to make sure others saw her for who she truly was, not just as a black woman, but as a leader, a public servant, and someone who had a right to be in this neighborhood just as much as anyone else. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street. The neighbors were still there, standing in their yards, talking amongst themselves. They had probably spent the last few minutes discussing what had just happened. Chandra wondered if they would change how they saw her after this. Would they ever realize that their assumptions had been wrong? Would they ever understand the hurt that their actions had caused? She couldn't control what other people thought, but she could control how she responded. Chandra wasn't going to let this incident define her. She wasn't going to let the ignorance of others make her doubt her place in this town. She was the mayor, and she was here to stay. The next morning, Chandra woke up early, like she always did. It was still dark outside, but she was used to getting up before the sun. As the mayor, her days were packed with meetings, phone calls, and decisions that affected everyone in her town. She took a deep breath as she stretched and began her morning routine, trying to shake off the heaviness from the day before. But the events of the previous evening were still fresh in her mind, hovering over her like a cloud. She knew she couldn't just forget about what had happened. It was something that needed to be addressed, both for herself and for the people in her community. As she walked into the kitchen and began to prepare a cup of coffee, Chandra's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and saw that it was a message from her assistant. The message was short, but it made her pause. It said that the local news had caught wind of the incident, and they were already asking questions. Chandra felt a knot form in her stomach. She hadn't expected this to make the news, but she realized that it was too big to be kept quiet for long. The last thing she wanted was for the entire town to know about the police incident. She knew how quickly rumors could spread, and she didn't want the story to be twisted or misunderstood. She needed to act fast. Chandra quickly typed a response to her assistant, telling them to hold off on any public statements for now. She wasn't ready to go public with her side of the story just yet. She wanted to think this through carefully, to figure out what to say, and how to handle it in a way that would not only clear up the confusion, but also make a point about the bigger issue at hand: racism and the assumptions people make based on appearances. Chandra took a sip of her coffee, the warmth of the cup helping to calm her nerves. As she sat there, she thought about her neighbors. Would they ever come to her and apologize for what had happened? Would they even realize the harm they had caused by calling the police on her, the mayor, in the first place? She doubted it. In her experience, people who made assumptions like that rarely ever admitted they were wrong. But still, she hoped they would at least take the time to reflect on what they had done. She glanced out the window, watching as the sun began to rise. The neighborhood was quiet, just like it always was at this time of day. She had lived here for years, and most of the time, it was a peaceful place. But after last night, it felt different. She wondered if her neighbors saw her any differently now. Was there a part of them that still doubted whether she belonged? She couldn't help but feel that the trust she had worked so hard to build in this community had been shaken. Chandra's phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, it was a call from one of the town council members. She answered quickly, trying to hide the exhaustion in her voice. "Good morning," the council member said. "I just wanted to check in after everything that happened yesterday. Are you okay? I heard about the police being called to your house." Chandra sighed. She appreciated the concern, but it wasn't easy to talk about. She didn't want to admit how much the incident had shaken her. Not because she was weak, but because she didn't want anyone to think she was looking for sympathy. She was the mayor, and she was supposed to be strong. But today, she didn't feel very strong. She felt vulnerable. "I'm doing okay," she said, her voice steady. "But there's a bigger issue here that I think we need to talk about. People made assumptions about me based on the way I look. They called the police on me, even though I was just coming home from work, and it's not the first time something like this has happened. It's a reminder that, no matter how much we've accomplished, there are still people who see us as different." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the council member responded. "That's awful," they said. "I can't believe this is happening in our town. But you're right. We can't ignore it. We need to address this. Maybe this is an opportunity to open up a larger conversation about racism and how we can work together to create a community where everyone feels welcome." The day of the meeting finally arrived, and Chandra couldn't shake the feeling of nervousness that had settled in her chest. She had spent the last few days thinking about the best way to address what had happened, and now it was time to face her community head-on. She had always believed in open conversations and addressing problems directly, but this felt different. This wasn't just about one misunderstanding. It was about challenging the deep-rooted biases that still existed in her town. She knew this meeting wasn't going to be easy, but she couldn't back down. She arrived at the community center early, wanting to get everything ready before the crowd started to arrive. The room was large and bright, with rows of chairs set up in front of a podium. A few members of the town council had already shown up, their faces serious, knowing this meeting would be important. Chandra walked to the front and stood by the podium, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she also felt a spark of determination. This was her chance to make a real difference, to start a conversation that needed to happen. As the clock ticked closer to the start time, more people began to filter into the room. Neighbors, local business owners, and even the officers who had responded to the call the night before were starting to fill the seats. Chandra noticed the uneasy glances exchanged between some of the attendees, their discomfort evident. She could tell that many of them had no idea what to expect. They had come because they felt it was the right thing to do, but most of them still didn't fully understand what had happened or why it was such a big deal. When the meeting began, Chandra stepped up to the podium, her heart racing. She cleared her throat, looking out at the crowd. For a moment, there was silence. Everyone was waiting for her to speak, to explain why they were all gathered there. She took a deep breath and started. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," she began, her voice steady, though she felt the nerves in her stomach. "I know this isn't an easy conversation, but it's one that we need to have. Yesterday, something happened that shouldn't have. I was called by the police for simply coming home to my house, where I've lived for years. It was a misunderstanding, yes, but it was also something deeper. It was a reflection of how some people still see me, and people like me, in this town." Chandra paused, letting her words sink in. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some of them curious, some uncomfortable, but she pushed forward. "I've spent my career working for this community," she continued. "I've been elected to represent everyone here, to make this town a better place for all of us. But no matter how much I do, no matter how much I've given, there are still people who look at me and make assumptions. And that's what happened here. Someone assumed that I didn't belong in this neighborhood, simply because of the color of my skin." She saw a few heads nodding in the crowd, but she also noticed some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She couldn't ignore that this was hard for them. Conversations about race, especially in a town like this, weren't something people were used to having. But Chandra was determined to push through. "Now, I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty," she said, her tone softening. "I'm here to start a conversation. A conversation about how we can make this town a place where everyone feels welcome, where no one has to fear being judged simply by how they look. We have to be honest with each other about the biases that exist, even if they're uncomfortable to talk about. We need to face them, not hide from them." A low murmur spread through the room as people started to look at each other, considering her words. It wasn't easy for them to hear, but Chandra could tell they were listening. The officers who had been involved in the incident the night before sat quietly in the front row, their faces serious. Chandra knew that this was the moment for them to learn, as much as it was for her neighbors. One of the officers raised his hand, his voice calm but apologetic. "I just want to say, we didn't know who you were when we first arrived. We were following up on a call. But after everything was cleared up, I realized it shouldn't have gone that far. I'm sorry for what happened. I should have asked more questions before making that call." Chandra nodded, appreciating the officer's apology. It wasn't easy for him to admit his mistake, but it was a step in the right direction. "Thank you," she said. "I understand that you were just doing your job. But we all have a role to play in making sure these things don't happen again." As the meeting continued, Chandra could feel the weight of the conversation growing. There was a shift in the room. a sense of tension mixed with the hope that something positive could come from this uncomfortable discussion. Some of the people who had spoken earlier, their voices defensive or unsure, began to quiet down. It wasn't that they had suddenly agreed with everything Chandra was saying, but something in her words seemed to have struck a chord. Maybe it was the raw honesty in her voice, or maybe it was the fact that for the first time, they were all being asked to look at their community from a different perspective. Chandra could tell that many of the attendees were struggling to put their feelings into words, but that was exactly why they needed this conversation. Silence wasn't going to change anything. A few people raised their hands, wanting to share their thoughts, and Chandra nodded for them to speak. One of the neighbors, a woman who had lived in the area for years, stood up slowly. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the back of the chair in front of her. "I've lived here my whole life," she began, her voice quieter than she intended. "I've never really thought about how people like you might feel in this neighborhood. I've never been through what you've gone through. And maybe I've assumed too much, too many times." She paused, her eyes shifting around the room. "I didn't know how to put it into words before, but I get it now. We need to change." Chandra listened closely, her expression softening as the woman spoke. It wasn't often that people acknowledged their own biases so openly. It was a small but powerful step, and Chandra wanted to make sure that the woman felt heard. "Thank you," Chandra said, her voice calm but filled with appreciation. It takes courage to recognize that we all have room to grow. We don't have to have all the answers right now, but we can start with the willingness to listen and learn from each other. The room felt different now, less tense. People were starting to see that this wasn't about placing blame, but about growing together as a community. Slowly, others began to speak up, sharing their own experiences and thoughts. There was a noticeable shift, where once there had been resistance, now there was curiosity and understanding. As the conversation continued, Chandra noticed a few of the younger residents taking notes. Some were nodding in agreement, others were just listening intently. The younger generation, she realized, might be the key to real change. They were more open to these kinds of conversations. They were more willing to challenge outdated ways of thinking and create a future where everyone truly felt welcome. One of the officers who had been at her house the night before stood up as well. His voice was steady, but there was a deep sincerity in it. "I want to apologize too," he said. "I was just doing my job, but I should have paid more attention." Chandra nodded, grateful for his honesty. "Thank you. Apologies are important, but actions speak louder. I appreciate your apology, and I believe that together we can make sure this doesn't happen again." There was a pause, and the room fell quiet for a moment. Chandra could feel the momentum building, like the room had collectively agreed to take responsibility for the future of their community. She didn't expect things to change overnight, but this was the first step. She could see that people were starting to understand the importance of making sure that no one felt out of place in their own home. "One of the things we can do," Chandra continued, looking around the room, "is create more opportunities for us to have these kinds of discussions, so we can understand each other better. We need to make sure that we're not just listening, but acting on what we've learned. If we want this to be a town where everyone feels like they belong, we need to challenge our assumptions and work together." A few people nodded in agreement. They were beginning to see how deep-rooted the problem was. It wasn't just about one misunderstanding or a single incident. It was about a pattern, something that had been happening for far too long without being addressed. Chandra's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was filled with the weight of what they had just begun to acknowledge. There was still a long way to go, but Chandra felt a glimmer of hope. Change wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but this was the start of something important. As the meeting came to a close, Chandra thanked everyone for their willingness to engage. She knew that not everyone in the room was convinced, and some people still needed more time to process what had been said. But she also knew that they had made a significant step forward. People had opened their hearts and minds, even if just a little, and that was something. In the weeks that followed the meeting, Chandra noticed a subtle but important shift in her town. It wasn't dramatic or immediate, but things were changing. People were starting to talk to each other more openly, and there was a new sense of awareness in the air. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now smiled and waved when they passed each other on the street. Some even stopped to chat, their conversations lighter than before, but still meaningful. It was as if the walls that had once existed between them were starting to come down, brick by brick. Chandra didn't expect things to change overnight, and she didn't expect everyone to suddenly agree on everything. But she could feel a difference in the way people were thinking, and that was enough to give her hope. In fact, she had seen more people come forward to talk about their own experiences that they had been too afraid or too embarrassed to share before. People were asking questions, and more importantly, they were listening to the answers. One afternoon, Chandra received a call from a local business owner. The man on the other end of the line had been quiet for a moment before speaking up. "Chandra," he said, his voice uncertain but sincere, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at that meeting. I'm not proud of some of the things I've done in the past, but I want to change. I've been working in this town for years, but I never really understood what it was like for people who are different from me. I want to do better." Chandra was taken aback by the call. She had known this man for years, and while he had always seemed friendly enough, she hadn't realized how much his own biases had shaped the way he ran his business. His admission wasn't easy for him, but Chandra could tell it came from a genuine desire to improve. "Thank you for reaching out," she said. "It takes a lot of courage to recognize that you need to change. I'm glad you're willing to take the next steps. I'm sure you'll find that as you open up more, you'll not only improve your business, but also help make this town a better place for everyone." Chandra spent the next few weeks working closely with local leaders, including the police department, to create programs that encourage more open dialogue and better understanding between residents and law enforcement. They started holding regular town hall meetings where people could come and talk about their concerns without fear of judgment. The goal wasn't just to address the past, but to work toward a future where everyone was treated equally and fairly. One of the programs Chandra was particularly proud of was a community outreach initiative that aimed to foster better relationships between the police and young people in the town. She had seen firsthand how misunderstandings could escalate when there was a lack of communication, and she was determined to prevent that from happening again. The program included workshops on conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of asking questions before making assumptions. Chandra worked with both the police and local youth organizations to make sure that everyone had a chance to participate. She knew that these young people, the next generation of leaders, would be the key to lasting change. They were the ones who would carry the lessons forward and ensure that the progress they had made wasn't lost. It wasn't just about teaching young people how to interact with law enforcement. It was about teaching everyone how to respect one another's differences and work together toward a common goal. Meanwhile, the people who had attended the community meeting continued to reach out to Chandra. Some of them expressed their gratitude for her leadership, while others wanted to share how the conversation had changed their perspective on race and belonging. Some had even begun volunteering for the town's new outreach programs, offering their time to help build bridges where there had once been walls. One afternoon, Chandra walked through the town's main street, which had always felt a little disconnected from the rest of the town. It was lined with shops that had been there for years, but the storefronts had begun to look a little dated, as if they hadn't seen much love or attention in a long time. However, as she walked past, she noticed something different. A new art mural was being painted on one of the walls, vibrant and full of life. It was a mural designed by local students, and its theme was unity, celebrating the diversity of the town. Chandra smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell in her chest. This mural wasn't just a piece of art. It was a symbol of the progress they had made together. It was proof that change was happening, even if it was still in its early stages. It was evidence that the conversations they had started were leading to something bigger, something that would continue to grow as more people joined in. As the months went by, the changes in the town became even more noticeable. What had started as a few conversations and small initiatives was now growing into something much larger. The community felt different. People seemed more open to one another, more willing to listen, and more willing to help each other out. Chandra could see it in the way people interacted, the way they walked down the street, and how they looked at each other with more understanding. The success of the programs she had helped to implement wasn't just in the numbers. Though the turnout for the town hall meetings and workshops was encouraging, it was in the stories she heard from the people who had taken part. One woman, who had been quiet during the first few meetings, shared how her relationship with her neighbors had changed. She spoke about how she had been afraid to approach people who were different from her in the past, unsure of how to connect. But now, she was meeting with them regularly, helping out at community events, and even inviting them to her home. "I never thought it would be this easy," she admitted, smiling as she spoke. "I used to think we were too different. But now, I see that we're not so different after all. We all just want to feel like we belong." Hearing these words filled Chandra with a sense of pride. This was what she had hoped for, people learning to see beyond their differences, coming together to build something stronger than they had before. And it wasn't just a few people. More and more residents were sharing similar experiences. The town was slowly but surely becoming a place where inclusivity wasn't just a goal, it was becoming a reality. Chandra also saw the impact of the youth programs that had been put into place. The younger generation, who had once been disconnected from the older residents, were now more involved. Many of them had taken part in the workshops on conflict resolution and cultural awareness, and they were starting to apply those lessons in their everyday lives. Some of them had even started their own initiatives, organizing events and projects that celebrated the diversity of their town. One afternoon, a group of teenagers came to Chandra with an idea for a new community event, a cultural festival that would highlight the different backgrounds and traditions of the people living in their town. They wanted it to be a day where everyone could share their food, music, art, and stories, creating a celebration of everything that made their town unique. Chandra was excited by the idea, and she immediately agreed to help them get it off the ground. Together, they worked tirelessly, planning the event from the ground up. The festival became a huge success, with people from all walks of life coming together to showcase their cultures and traditions. There was music, food, and art from different countries, all mingling in one place, showing how diverse and beautiful their town had become. But the true success wasn't in the event itself. It was in the way the community came together to make it happen. People who had never spoken before were now working side by side, their differences no longer barriers but opportunities to learn from one another. The festival became a turning point for the town, a clear sign that they were moving in the right direction. Chandra couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment as she walked through the festival, watching people of all ages and backgrounds laughing, eating, and enjoying each other's company. She saw the children running around, their faces painted with designs from different cultures, their laughter echoing through the air. It was a beautiful sight. This was the future she had dreamed of, a future where everyone, regardless of their race or background, could live side by side in harmony. As the festival wound down and people began to pack up their booths and stalls, Chandra stood on the steps of the town hall, taking a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The road had been long, and there were still challenges ahead, but there was no denying the progress that had been made. The town was no longer divided by fear or misunderstandings. Instead, it was united by the shared goal of building a better future for everyone. As the year came to a close, Chandra looked around her town with a sense of accomplishment, but also with a deep understanding that the journey was far from over. So much had changed, and yet there was still work to be done. The conversations, the programs, and the events had all made a difference, but the true challenge was ensuring that the progress wasn't just a temporary shift. It needed to be a lasting change, something that would continue long after she was no longer in office. Chandra knew that for the work they had done to stick, it had to be deeply rooted in the community's everyday life. The changes needed to feel natural, part of the town's fabric, not something that was just forced into place because of a few meetings or events. She was committed to making sure that the foundation they had started to build would continue to grow, and that everyone in the town could see the importance of staying connected and working together. One of the key steps she took to ensure this was to establish an ongoing mentorship program. She wanted to make sure that the younger generation, who had been so passionate about the changes, would continue to lead the charge. Chandra started connecting them with mentors, older residents who had lived through many changes in the town and who could offer wisdom and guidance. The goal was to bridge the gap between generations to allow for a healthy exchange of ideas and experiences. She wanted to make sure that the lessons learned in the past weren't forgotten, while also giving the youth the chance to shape the future. The mentorship program was an immediate success. Young people began learning more about their town's history, its ups and downs, and the people who had worked tirelessly in the past to make things better. The older generation, in turn, found themselves learning from the younger people, their fresh perspectives on the world, helping to broaden their understanding of the issues they face today. It was a partnership that allowed both groups to grow and evolve together. Another initiative Chandra helped create was the Unity Day celebration, an event that would take place every year to mark the progress the town had made and to reinforce the idea that unity was not just a one-time effort, but a continual process. It was a day for people to come together, not just to celebrate their differences, but to acknowledge the importance of embracing those differences as strengths. Over time, the event became one of the town's most beloved traditions, drawing visitors from surrounding areas and putting the town on the map for its progressive, inclusive community. Despite all the positive changes, Chandra was still aware of the challenges. There were some who didn't quite understand the need for all of this change, people who still clung to their old ways of thinking. And while the town had made significant progress, she knew that even in the best of communities, not everyone would always agree on everything. But that wasn't the point. The point was that they had created a space where people could come together to share their differences, learn from them, and grow stronger because of them. As Chandra sat in her office one evening, reflecting on the progress that had been made, she received a letter. It was from a resident who had been skeptical at first, someone who had been reluctant to embrace the changes and who had initially been one of the loudest voices of dissent. The letter was simple, but its message was powerful. "I didn't get it at first. I thought things were fine the way they were. But after seeing how everyone is working together and really listening to each other, I understand now. I see how much better things are when we all make an effort to understand each other. I'm glad I stuck around to see the change. It's not perfect, but it's progress, and I'm proud to be part of it." Reading those words, Chandra felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why she had fought so hard. Not to be proven right, but to see people come together, to see them evolve, and to witness a community that was stronger, kinder, and more united because of the work they had all done together. It wasn't about making everyone agree. It was about creating an environment where people felt seen, heard, and respected. Chandra knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would always be obstacles, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But the foundation had been laid, and the work would continue. She had faith in the people of her town, in their ability to keep pushing forward, and in their commitment to building a better future for everyone.